semester's conversations with BIPOC theater artists engaged in explorations of race and power in their work as playwrights, dramaturgs, directors, designers, scholars, and activists. We're excited to engage in these vital conversations with some of the country's clearest voices at the center of creating anti-racist theater. So a few housekeeping items before we begin, and I will go through these fairly quickly. The conversation will be conducted in two parts. During the first 40 minutes or so, I'll engage in direct conversation with Mary Kathryn. And during this section, we ask that you keep all cameras turned off and mics muted. For optimal viewing, please keep your cameras on speaker view. Then after about 40 minutes, we'll open up for a Q&A, at which point we welcome you to turn cameras on and remain muted until you speak. For part two, we invite you to shift to gallery view. Please note the conversation is being recorded. The chat is being monitored by our program manager, Nicholas Horner. Feel free to post questions and comments there during the course of the conversation. And finally, we may address topics and ideas containing sensitive material. Let us remember to remain respectful, open, and growth-centered as a community. At the place George Mason University occupies, we give greetings and thanksgivings to these Potomac River life sources: the Manahoic ancestors, the Rappahannock, Pamunkey, Mattaponi, Upper Mattaponi, Chickahominy, Eastern Chickahominy, Nansmoon, Manakin, Patawomic, and Nottoway, past, present, and future, and to the Piscataway tribes who have lived on both sides of the river from time immemorial. I invite you to acknowledge the indigenous stewards of the land wherever you are writing, by writing their names in the chat. Just a brief biography of today's guest artist. Mary Kathryn Nagle is an enrolled citizen of the Cherokee Nation, an attorney who works to protect tribal sovereignty and the inherent right of Indian nations to protect their women and children from domestic violence and sexual assault, and a celebrated playwright. Mary Kathryn is an alum of the 2013 Public Theater Emerging Writers Program and served as the first executive director of the Yale Indigenous Performing Arts Program from 2015 to 2019. Production credits include Miss Lead, Fairly Traceable, Sovereignty, Manahata, Return to Niobrara, and Crossing Minnesota. She has received commissions from Arena Stage, the Rose Theater, Portland Center Stage, Denver Center for the Performing Arts, Yale Repertory Theater, Roundhouse Theater, and Oregon Shakespeare Festival. She is most well known for her work on ending violence against Native women. Her play, Sliver of a Full Moon, has been performed in law schools from Stanford to Harvard, New York University, and Yale. She has worked extensively on Violence Against Women Act reauthorization and has filed numerous briefs in the United States Supreme Court as part of the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center's VAWA Sovereignty Initiative, including most recently, United States versus Cooley, Oklahoma versus McGirt, and Oklahoma versus Murphy. She represents numerous families of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, including Kasara Stops Pretty Places family, who have brought a public campaign demanding an investigation into her murder. I've been a fan of her work for a very long time, and it's an honor and privilege to welcome playwright, activist, and attorney Mary Kathryn Nagle to the virtual stage. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Really appreciate it.
Yes, I appreciate you, and I'm glad we got you in.
Yes, I know. Well, it feels like it's always a challenge with Zoom.
Yes, It's wonderful.
Yeah.
I like to start by asking my artists where they're from, because I feel as if all of us bring our culture, identities, histories, and herstories into our artistic work. I'm always interested in how life experience informs creative practice. I'm wondering if you can tell us about the communities that you call home, that you've inhabited, about which of those have grounded, nourished, and or challenged you, and how those communities and experiences inform the stories you tell.
I love that question for many reasons, but yeah, so I mean, today I live not very far away from you all. Actually, I'm living over here in McLean, so which is very close to you. So, but originally I was born in Oklahoma, and I have a lot of family there, and I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, which is a tribe in Oklahoma. Historically, before forced removal, our nation was in the southeastern part of the United States, and specifically my family, before they were on the Trail of Tears, lived in what is now known as Rome, Georgia. And so, you know, that very much claim that part of Georgia as home as well. I also grew up, I spent a significant part of my childhood living in Joplin, Missouri, which is in this region they call the fourth state area, where Kansas, Oklahoma, Missouri, and Arkansas meet. And then I also went to high school in Kansas. So I have a real solid connection to like the heart of the Midwest, I would say. Yes. Although Oklahoma is not technically the Midwest. Oklahoma is a weird state. It's sort of not the Southwest and it's not the Southeast.
I agree. I always am surprised when people consider it the Midwest, having been there.
Because it's not really the Midwest. Yeah, but it's like not the Southwest and it's not the Southeast, and it's this weird, it's Indian country, as the Supreme Court just said. Any event, let's see. So I've actually been blessed to live in a number of places that have really shaped me. I went to college in this area, so I kind of first got introduced to this area when I was a college student, probably similar to many of you. Loved it. And then I went to law school in New Orleans, and so I had 3 years in New Orleans, and I actually moved there 3 weeks before Hurricane Katrina hit. So that was a very formative experience, going through all of that with the community. And then I went and clerked for 1 year for 2 federal judges at a federal courthouse in downtown Omaha, Nebraska. And that was also very formative. I loved my time in Nebraska. And then I went and clerked on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals with a federal judge down in Austin, Texas. And I loved Austin, Texas. Loved it. And then, and that was very formative as well. Then I went to New York and lived in New York City and worked there for 5 years. Before then I did a series of I moved to DC, but then I moved back to Oklahoma, and then I moved back here. So I've sort of just ever since then gone back and forth between Oklahoma and here, but they've all been very formative experiences. And I consider Cherokee Nation is a strong part of my identity and who I am and my community. But I'm also a playwright, so the theater community is very close to the theater community. I'm a lawyer, so I feel very close to the legal community as well, and really feel close to the communities, and especially Omaha. Not as much Austin these days, but I've gone back to Omaha several times, and that's a little bit of my life story.
It's great, and I can see certainly a number of those influences in the work that I've read and that of yours that I'm familiar with. So it's exciting to hear you name it. So like institutions of higher learning everywhere, George Mason is grappling with difficult questions of representation and inclusion on our stages and in our classrooms. And as I mentioned the other day, this guest artist series grew out of my graduate course, Dramatic Theory and Criticism, Unpacking Race and Power in Contemporary American Theater. The curriculum of that course represents a deliberate departure from the traditional approach to dramatic theory, which centers European scholars, discourse, and modes of making. My course seeks to develop more awareness of the ways in which underrepresentation of marginalized voices persist in the American theater, and to become more familiar with artists and scholars of color engaged in conversations for radical change and racial justice, to cultivate more comfort and proficiency when discussing race, power, and privilege, and ultimately to identify and articulate how race informs our own aesthetics, processes, and practices as theater makers. That course is kind of a small part of multiple initiatives launched.
Sounds like an amazing course.
Thanks. I enjoyed it probably as much as the students. But all of our theater faculty are continuing to decolonize our syllabi, to unpack implicit bias, race, power, privilege on our stages, as well as in our classrooms. And for me, your work as an artist and advocate for social justice really seems that those two pillars seem inextricably woven into your work. And they offer a way of rethinking and expanding what we think of as the American canon of dramatic literature. So, I mean, is it fair to say that arts and activism are both driving forces in your work, and how so?
Yeah, absolutely. It's hard to say which I became first, an artist or a lawyer, because I was always a storyteller as a kid growing up. I did theater as a kid. I did theater in college, but I wasn't recognized as a professional playwright, which is sort of, a weird term that gets thrown around when you have like an equity production or you get an agent or something, because at some point you actually, if you're very fortunate, you can start making money as a playwright. Whereas until that point in time, it just costs you money to be a playwright. I was spending a lot of my own money on community productions with tribes and other community groups. And then one day was very fortunate enough to have a theater say, we're actually going to pay you to do your play instead of you paying to have your play done, which, right. But, so I actually became a professional lawyer before I became a professional playwright. But the two, I've sort of been trying to be both for most of my life. And I think that, I approach both, with a very social justice sort of, deconstructing colonialism mind frame. But I do think that in many ways, theater and storytelling can accomplish more than what the law can. And I say that because getting the law to change is sort of the last piece of the puzzle. It's the last thing to happen. If you look at any massive social justice movement, the movers of that movement, the movers and shakers, had to change the narrative first, right? Had to change the story. And usually the story is, if there's a huge injustice, usually the story is some group of people are not human, or they're inferior, or they're less than. And that's how you get injustice, right? So if you look at, the American Indians in the United States, right? If you look at the way the Supreme Court has talked about us over time, you look at, the Johnson v. McIntosh decision in 1823. Okay, you've got the Supreme Court saying that Native Americans, Indians, are racially inferior, savages, and heathens. And that's why they can't, under the law, claim title, like legal title to their lands. And that decision forms the basis. That's what the Supreme Court cited in 1978, when the Supreme Court said, and you know what? We're not going to let tribes exercise criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians who come onto tribal lands and commit crimes. And then you fast forward to today, and Native women are more likely to be sexually assaulted or abused or murdered than any other population in the United States. And the Department of Justice reports that the majority of those violent crimes are committed by non-Indians, which we know, because of the 1978 decision in Oliphant, tribes can't prosecute the majority of those crimes.
Prosecute them, right.
So you've got a real legal conundrum, but at the root of it is this story that's embedded in the law, right? And how do you change that story? Well, you can write briefs, you can walk the halls of Congress and pound on their doors and beg them to legislate. But people move when their hearts move, right? They move when they get to know someone that historically for them has been a community or an identity that's been dehumanized, when it becomes rehumanized. And that could be, through really creative actions like what Martin Luther King Jr. did, you know, in the civil rights movement, but it can also be through storytelling. And storytelling is a form, I think, of civil disobedience in a way. And I
Mm.
think that if you look at some of the various movements in this country for justice, the ones that have had the most success have changed the narrative, whatever the narrative was that was holding back progress. And so
Yes.
I see my plays from that viewpoint, but I see a lot of work from that viewpoint. I mean, if you look at Joy Harjo, who's the first Native ever US poet laureate, you've got high schools and colleges teaching her poems to students who may have never met a Native American,
That's
which is
right.
crazy, right? But like,
Right.
and now they're reading her poetry and they're having to write essays about it. And so they can't put an Indian in this box of just that thing I saw on in TV in Dances with Wolves or whatever, you know,
That's right.
or
Right.
the latest Taylor Sheridan show like Yellowstone.
Right.
You know, they've got to now say, actually, you know, Joy Harjo is a Native and I'm reading her poetry and it's really complex. You know, it's not just one size fits all for all Native people. So the arts and storytelling go hand in hand with the work I do for legal change and legal progress, because I don't think it would be possible to change the law without the arts.
Without changing the minds, without changing the
Mhm.
hearts.
Yep.
I'm so with you on that.
Mhm.
I never thought about, I love many gems in what you said, but storytelling as social, just social discourse, social justice. Love that. I'm wondering, I'm quoting from the website of the Native Arts and Cultures Foundation. I guess it was a blog post that was put up several years ago. It said that your play, Mannahatta, tells parallel stories of two indigenous families that span across more than 4 centuries, while brilliantly weaving colonization and modern day history. You pull from your own experience as a corporate litigation lawyer during the 2008 financial crisis to illustrate the plight of your main character, Jane Snake, a Delaware Nation Stanford graduate who takes a job on Wall Street at Lehman Brothers. And the plot sort of flows seamlessly back and forth between a Lenape family forced to leave their land after the purchase of Manhattan by the Dutch in 1654, and the family of Jane Snake, who is forced into refinancing their home under unfavorable terms after the death of Jane's father, while she deals with the challenges of the mortgage crisis on the financial institution side. Yeah, I know a lot of people who were struck by that as well. Mannahatta was produced by the Oregon Shakespeare Festival in 2018. And I stumbled upon a brief interview with you during the run of that play in which you were calling attention to how cool it was that audiences who had come to see Elizabethan drama might also see a completely different view of American history and storytelling. Now, sort of 4 years out, what was the Oregon Shakespeare Festival experience like for you? And do you have any other thoughts on that in hindsight?
Gosh, hard to believe it's been 4 years, but
I know.
you know, it's crazy how
I
time
know.
flies with COVID but
Yeah.
you know, it was such an incredible experience in so many ways. I mean, it's like I describe it as Disney World for theater goers, you know, because it's its own little bubble of people who love theater and love storytelling and people who come to it because they love theater and love storytelling. And it's just such a wonderful, wonderful place to be because you're just there making theater. But, you know, it was interesting. It was the second play ever by a Native playwright that they had ever produced. And so, you know, when you're entering that kind of a space and there really isn't a long history of that institution producing stories from a certain community, there are going to be growing pains, there are going to be lessons learned, you know, on my end and on the theater's end. I'm learning how to better communicate things about my work and about, you know, what's appropriate for a Native play and what's not. And it's challenging. And it's challenging because there are always examples where people don't mean to be offensive, but they say something out of ignorance and it just happens. At the same time, it was incredibly exhilarating. I mean, everyone that I worked with from the theater was really invested in making the play as much of a success as possible. They were really invested in putting whatever resources necessary into BIPOC plays to ensure that they get what they need to succeed, which is not always true for a lot of theaters.
Mhm.
And having it in conversation with these other shows was really interesting. And I think it heightened the perception of my own play, because people would go see a Shakespearean play that they taught was of high intellectual value growing up,
Yeah.
whether they were taught that in high school or college or a PhD program, and then they'd see that thing that they've been told that's really intellectual and brilliant, and then they'd
Yeah.
come sit and listen to a Native story that includes in this play some talk about residential mortgage-backed securities in the banking industry, but also like traditional stories of Lenape knowledge and culture, and and so they're getting fed this, and they're all in this environment where everything is supposed to be very intellectual, right? And so it introduces these stories to people who would otherwise not encounter them in a way that they otherwise would not conceive of them, I think.
Right.
So I think it's an incredible opportunity. Like, I think, as we sort of talked about, I don't want to see Shakespeare go away, and I think sometimes our allies are, to be quite honest, our white allies feel like when people are pushing for more BIPOC plays, they're saying, get rid of Shakespeare. We're not saying that at all. At least I'm not saying that.
Right.
Is Shakespeare my favorite playwright? No. I actually like playwrights closer in time to me, but like, I still like and appreciate his work, and I think it has significant value. And I think it's great to be in conversation with Shakespeare and other playwrights, So I really loved that part of being at the festival. And the other thing that's really cool too is I will say that for a lot of my Native actors that were in my play, they had never been given a chance to be, Lady Macbeth or, whoever, because, well, they're Native, right? And so it was this weird, but like at OSF, they cast anyone in these Shakespeare plays, right? They're not like, so it was like the first time for these Native actors to have that opportunity on a big stage to play also these Shakespearean roles, and to be around these actors who have 30 years under their belt of doing Shakespeare. And that was, I think, a cool experience as well for the Native theater community,
Wow. Wow. It sounds incredible. And actually your last comment is a great sort of segue into the next question, which is, if you had to offer one strategy for decolonizing the way we make, discuss, frame contemporary American theater, what would it be? For my money, you've already suggested one, because I think about plays like, Hamilton, for example, right? Where we're not reframing history, but we are saying that we are entitled to be a part of it, to participate in it, to own it in all those ways that historically we have not been afforded.
It's interesting you bring up Hamilton, because I love Hamilton, and I know it got some criticism, sort of for, if I can frame it right, and I'm not one of the critics really, so I might be misrepresenting people who want to criticize Hamilton, what the critique is, but that to your point, it doesn't reframe. It's still sort of this narrative that celebrates our white founding fathers in this not very critical at all lens. But you know what? Like, I don't think that, I think there's a place for Hamilton in our American canon, and I think that we don't need to, and even some of these plays that are problematic, like Guys and Dolls, or, things that are really sexist or racist. I'm not saying that I don't think high school should be producing them, actually, because that's different than professionals, but they should still be studied and talked about. We need to learn that, because we come from that. And if we cut that off, we don't understand why we have some of the problems in American society that we have today. And I think too, like, will always have these stories of reverence for the founding fathers of the United States, right? I think we as a country need to grow to criticize them fairly for what they did, just like we should criticize anyone today fairly for what they do and for what we do. We all do things as individuals that contribute to the larger system of massive incarceration, or, we could all sit here and talk about the things that we're responsible for. And so as long as we're acknowledging that, I think these stories of reverence for our founding fathers do have a place within our storytelling framework. And now, could they be told exclusively to the exclusion of BIPOC stories? No, but because they're going to be told, should people of color have chances to tell them too? Why not? Why not? Like, why can't there be a Black Adam Hamilton, at some point, excuse me, Alexander Hamilton, got to get his name right. Why can't there be, so, now what I'm still not okay with is white people playing people of color on stage, because we're not there yet. That's my personal opinion. We haven't had enough. We've had so much history of misrepresentation of blackface and red face and yellow face and you name it, that I don't think we're quite at a place where a lot of Americans, when they see that, understand if the writer's intending some sort of larger metaphor, criticism, irony, which most actually are not. I will say, when I do see plays using red face, I usually try to ask the writer, what is the origin of the performance of red face in the United States? And they don't know. So I don't think you can be doing it. Huh?
I was going to ask, is that still happening? Is that still a thing?
In the last couple of years, not as much, but I will say 5 years ago, yes. And 10 years ago, you betcha. Because I lived in Manhattan in 2010 to 2015. And I didn't see a single professional theater produce a single play by a Native playwright, except for the Native run, Native owned, where the whole board of directors is Native, and everyone's busting their butt to raise $35,000 to produce a play off Broadway. Those theaters produce Native playwrights, but the mainstream, public theater, Manhattan Theater Club, the Atlantic, Second Stage, you name all of those theaters, right, were not producing a single Native play. And I saw 4 different productions that used red face at those theaters.
Wow.
Yeah. So, that is and that was just 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So I do think that, I think all people of color, the conversations have started to change. I think, especially after the murder of George Floyd, I think that there was this moment in the United States where there was some raising of consciousness. Now, I think sometimes we take 2 steps forward, 1 step back in this country. But I think that there is more of an acknowledgement now that red face is no longer appropriate or okay. Yeah. But I will tell you that 10 years ago, especially when it was super popular still, I would talk to the creators or producers of, Bloody Andrew Jackson. Do you understand, where does red face come from? Could not tell me the origins of the performance. They would say that they weren't doing it to dehumanize or be offensive to Native people. They were doing it to be funny. But I think you can't be funny.
Yeah.
If you're repeating a performance that was created to dehumanize someone and you don't understand the origins of that performance, that's not, humor isn't ignorance. Humor comes from an actual knowledge and then the creativity built on top of that. So
and funny anyways, to whom, right? Yeah, exactly. Wow, there's so much to unpack in there. I'm going to move on. Yes, it gets me thinking about blackface and a whole different. Yeah, and I agree with you. I don't think we're at a place necessarily where white actors can embody, characters, roles of color. But there's such been a long history where actors of color could not embody any
themselves.
Role on stage, let alone themselves.
Yeah.
So I think it's a very different history, a different trajectory, a different conversation. Mm-hmm. I don't want to run out of time, so I'm going to ask you if you would mind sharing with us who is creating theater that inspires you, past or present, and why?
That's a really great question. So many folks. I will say, when I was in high school and college, the playwright that inspired me the most was Paula Vogel. I just have always loved and admired her work. and her and what she's the subject matter, the way she's tackled it. And I just felt like her voice was so brave to tackle these things. And so I just, growing up, that was someone who, I remember I got to meet her when I was a junior in college at this event that I went to that she was speaking at the Kennedy Center. And when I got to shake her hand, I started crying, and she just like hugged me. She was like, "It's okay." So I loved her. And so, sort of like when you grow up, and someone's like that larger than life, and then you meet them in real life, and it just couldn't fathom it. I will also say other playwrights that have really inspired me, or just I feel like very impacted by their work. I have to mention Bill Yellowrobe, who is for Native theater artists. Like, a lot of us today are getting, like I said, like I got to be the second Native playwright ever produced at OSF. Well, you go back 10 years, you go back 20 years, you go back 30 years, there were no Native playwrights getting produced anywhere. And it's not for lack of talent, and it's not for lack of trying. It's just they were laying the foundation for those of us who are here today, where doors are starting to open because of everything the generation before us did. And he's, one of those of the generation before us. We unfortunately recently lost him, but he's got a lot of wonderful plays that have been published and produced. And Bill Yellowrobe, an amazing author, playwright, real advocate for the whole community. Other Native contemporary writers that really inspire me, Madeline Sayet. She has an amazing one-woman show right now that's actually going on tour, so you can Google it, check it out. Her play is called Where We Belong. Really
directed by Man Teo, I think. Yeah. I saw an interview with her. Forgot where it was, but yeah.
Yes, super amazing. And very personal, and it's what makes it so powerful. I also have to give a shout out to my Cherokee sister, Delana Studi, who also has a one-woman play that I'm really biased because I think being Cherokee, I'm just drawn to Cherokee stories, but her one-woman play is probably my favorite play I've ever seen in my life. Again, full disclosure, my family gets mentioned in it. Like it gets very personal, right? But her play is called And So We Walked, and it was the first Native play ever produced at Portland Center Stage. And she went on tour. She just kind of wrapped up a tour, and she's doing all kinds of amazing stuff with her life. I mean, she's the artistic director of the Native Voices at the Autry in LA, which is our only full-time, equity Native theater house that just produces Native plays all year round for equity actors. And she runs that theater, but her play And So We Walked is phenomenal. And another Native writer that I'll throw out that I really love and admire is Vera Bedard. She's Tlingit from Alaska, and she's been working with Perseverance Theater up there, and she's just been doing a series of really incredible plays, really incredible work. So I think, those playwrights, I mean, and then of course, August Wilson, really inspiring, another writer that I would say growing up, I read his work, and probably him and Paula were the ones where I felt like, because, there really weren't a lot of Native playwrights. I mean, there was Bill Yellowrobe, but Native playwrights weren't getting produced. And sort of reading Paula and August's work, I felt like, well, we may have to keep charting that path, but there's going to be a way in, right? Because they're writing these powerful stories for their communities and their perspectives. And those are the most immediate ones that come to my mind.
That's a pretty good list, Mary Kathryn. It's pretty good.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, I think if you read any of their works, you won't be disappointed.
Yeah. That's great. So talk to us a little bit about the play that you have in development coming up at Roundhouse Theater, right up the road.
Yeah. So that's exciting. So they commissioned me a while back, and it's a play. It's actually about my husband's mother, who I never got to meet because she passed away before we met. And she was an incredible activist. She's Muskogee, so she's full-blood Muskogee from the Muskogee Creek Nation, which is a tribe located in Oklahoma today. Traditionally, their homelands before removal were Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. And she just has an incredible life story. She was an incredible, incredible activist, but also an incredible survivor, because you think about her childhood. She was, I think she was taken away forcibly, as many kids were of her generation, and forced to go to boarding school by the federal government. And then she ran away 8 times. So, there were some stories, I think, when it was last summer when it came out, they found graves at a boarding school in Canada. And, people kind of really got a lot of press attention, which is good. But there are graves at every single boarding school here in the United States too. And when I think back, I think about her running away 8 times in a row. I mean, those kids, they sent attack dogs to get them in the forest as they were running away. I mean, those kids, if they got sick, they did not get to go home. They just died at school. They were sexually abused by teachers at these schools. They were beaten physically if they spoke their language. I mean, you talk about an experience that is designed to break you.
Yeah.
And the fact that she just kept running away until the 8 times, until the final time, they just gave up on her. The US government was like, forget that one. And didn't make her go back. And so there's so many stories in her life that are really powerful, and it's a one-woman play. It's my first time. So I think, to be honest, I wrote mine before I saw Madeline's play, but her play is definitely an inspiration. But I wrote it after seeing Delena's one-woman play, and it was so powerful. And I've always written like huge casts, like, my agent's always like, can you write a 2-handler? It'll be a lot easier to produce. And I've always written, I think the smallest cast size I have is like 6, Yeah. And I thought, this one-woman play by Delena is so powerful. I want to try that form of storytelling.
Right.
And my husband was like, you should write about my mom. And I was like, well, then you better tell me stories, So he was telling me all these stories, and they're beautiful. And some of them are in the play, but, one tragedy is we lost his dad in March of 2020, right when COVID hit. And we don't know if it was COVID because they weren't really testing for COVID then. They had just shut down the country. It was right when COVID was becoming known. And he was 86, and he couldn't breathe, and he had pneumonia, and who knows if it was COVID, but he died.
Yeah.
And so we went to his house to clean out his house, and we found in the bottom drawer next to his will, because my husband's the executor of his father's estate, this beautiful 110-page handwritten book that he had written about his wife.
Wow.
He had never told either one of his sons about it.
Wow.
Yeah. My other goal is to get it published, because it's such a beautiful, he was a PhD professor, and he was actually a first-generation immigrant. He ran away from India. He's Bengali, and when he was a kid, he grew up in Calcutta. I mean, he should have a play about his life, because he grew up in Calcutta, right when all of the right after India's independence. And so anyways, he when all the Muslims were being killed and in that part of India, and he has all these stories of his family hiding Muslims in their house, and because they were Hindu. And anyways, it's and then he comes over to the United States, and he meets this Muskogee woman, and they get married. And of course, both sides of the families are like, what you're marrying an Indian, but he wrote this beautiful book about her. And, he's like a very minor character in it. And so I really want to get that book published, but it's sort of the basis for this play about her, because I never got to meet her.
Yeah.
And I got to meet her.
What's the title of the play, Mary Kathryn?
So the play is called On the Far End.
On the Far
and
End.
It's called that because those are the first words of the Supreme Court's decision in McGirt versus Oklahoma. And that case was decided on July 9th, 2020 by the Supreme Court. And you may have heard about it. It's like one of the most famous Indian law cases to come out of the Supreme Court in ever. Besides the case that my grandfather's worked on in sovereignty, that really happened in 1832. But this case is phenomenal because the Supreme Court upheld the continued existence of the Creek Nation Reservation in present day Oklahoma. Huge victory for Creeks. And so my husband's Creek, his mom was full blood Creek. And he just, he kept, I know all day when the decision came out, it was he's like, I just wish my mom was here to see this, Yeah. And so the whole kind of introduction of why, and I don't want to give anything away because, Well, I've already said she died before I got to meet her, but don't I don't spoil the secret, but
I won't tell it.
yeah. So
Right.
anyways, so it's on the far end is named after the first few words of that incredible Supreme Court decision. It's not, the play itself isn't really about the decision. It's sort of like bookended by it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. All right. Fascinating. And I think it's coming up the last weekend in March, I think you told me, or something like that.
Yes. And I see that. Oh, thank you so much, Nicholas. He posted the press
Oh,
release.
thank you. Great.
And so you'll see it's mentioned in there. It's going to be, there's other plays too happening. It's like a new play festival.
Yeah,
and so there's 2 staged readings, and actually Delana Studi is the actress in the stage readings.
Okay.
So that's one of the playwrights I'm recommending everyone check out. And she will be playing Jean Chowdhury Hill, which is, or Jean Hill Chowdhury, which is main character. And so April 29th at 8 p.m. is one performance, and May 1st at 2 p.m. And I think I sent you a link to get tickets, which you feel free to share with your students. Okay. I'm not sure if they've put the link on the website yet. When I talked to them on Friday, they said that they're going to post the link for the like you all could get the tickets through the link I sent, but the public gets invited in like a week or so, because I guess that link is only being given to people who know the artists or who are subscribers to their season. But you all should, if you want to get a ticket, just go ahead and do it.
Thank you.
I think it's free, actually.
Yeah, thank you.
So it shouldn't cost any money.
No, it's all right. This will probably have to register for it or something. So.
You have to like create an account on their website, and but
the Roundhouse Theater is cool though anyway, so I don't mind creating an account for them.
Yeah.
This is lovely. I'm going to share the wealth and invite all the attendees to turn their cameras on at this point and shift to gallery view, and we can open the conversation for any questions and answers. Either raise your hand in real time or virtually, or write something in the chat. I'll try to recognize you as quickly as I can. Yes, hello? Philip?
Yes, I think I raised my hand. I don't know if you saw me. I need to use the hand raise thing. I love your story. First, I'd like to apologize for my tardiness. I come at the very tail end. And also, I forgot that I wasn't on mute. So if you heard me clicking, I apologize for that too.
Oh, no worries.
But I think it's the dopest idea. I love the oral history in regards to the book. And I'm just thinking, curiosity. First, I'm sorry about the passing of your family member. During COVID. That's very sad. Do you think I'm just. You feel like you don't need it? You wanted this to get published. Like you don't think like, oh, like this was supposed to be like his little, secret thing, or like I was just thinking about that.
Well,
he wrote like 100 something pages. He wrote 100 something pages, but like, was that like when you first read it? Like maybe that's what I'm trying to ask. My question, in your initial reading of this, you were like, wow, this is dope. I think I should publish it, or this is a family heirloom that passed down. Like, what was some of your initial reactions when you found this manuscript per se and wanted to read it?
That's a really great question. So, I'm going to go back and actually ask my husband what he thinks about that. But I think his initial reaction too was Dad would have wanted this published. But I will say part of that too, the backstory is he wrote his own autobiography that he always said he wanted to have published. He just never quite got around to fully finishing it. So I think his son could sort of do whatever you got to do to kind of finish it and get it off to the publisher. And his autobiography is called Of Topaz and Turquoise, which is sort of a play on words because, he came from India and married this amazing Muskogee woman. And, he also himself, he got his PhD at University of Oklahoma, and then went on and taught at several universities, and he taught American Indian political studies. And so he had several articles published, and he co-authored a book with Jean called The Sacred Path. And it's an amazing story that provides a chronology of some Creek history, but also a lot of culture, some of their traditional stories, and just it's an incredible book. And so he sort of had a history of publishing a lot of things. And it is interesting that he didn't really mention this one to anyone. But I also think too that he really, after Gene passed away, I think he kind of just was in so much grief. I don't know. I think he just emotionally too couldn't handle trying to publish it. But it's a really good and important question. And
Yeah.
I'll ask my husband, John Adev, what he thinks before we do anything else with it.
Yeah. And it'll
So-
be interesting. I mean, I think both things can live in the universe, right? The book,
Mhm.
the intimacy of that book, if you decide to publish it, and the show that you're writing, inspired
Yeah.
by real events. What did your father-in-law teach? Just out of curiosity.
He taught like a political science,
Okay.
American Indian studies.
Wonderful.
And he was a professor at University of Arizona, Arizona
Okay.
State University, South Dakota University for a while.
Yeah.
Where else? He was even at Florida State University for a bit. He was at Yale for a little bit. He was at Kent State for a little bit
Wow.
before the
Okay.
massacres.
Wow. Okay.
So yeah, his whole life story is
Lived through it.
fascinating.
Quite
Like,
an arc. Yeah.
mhm.
I see. Michael Nephew has his hand up.
OCO.
Yo, sister, how you doing?
Good to see you.
Good to see you. I'm looking forward to seeing your play at at Roundhouse.
Yeah.
Really looking forward to that. Love your work. Love the ones you're talking with. And I got to run real quick because I'm working with Tara Moses and Annalisa
Amazing.
at the Kennedy Center. That thing they're doing there.
Oh, cool. Okay.
So
Very cool.
yeah, just really enjoy. I'm like really proud of what you've been able to accomplish and what you hold Bill up. We all hold Bill up, of course.
Yeah.
We do that for you.
Oh.
That's who you are for us.
Oh. Thank
Love
you.
you, sister. I gotta
Well,
run.
Michael's being very humble. He's a famous Native actor, and he's actually been in several plays of mine several times over the years. So it's really good to see you, Michael, and break legs. And I'll see you in a few weeks then.
Okay, and Dr.
you.
Brenner, we'll have to get in touch because I'm actually taking
Love
some
it.
courses out at Mason.
I would love it. All right. Thank you for coming, Michael.
Okay, I'll get in touch with you.
All right.
Yeah, I can
Bye-bye.
connect you too if you need me to. Bye, Michael.
Great.
Bye.
Thank you.
Very cool. When his
Wonderful.
camera was off, I was like,
Is that who I
the Michael nephew I know? Or is there another Michael nephew at George
That's
Mason?
wonderful.
Yeah, that's so cool.
All right. Nicholas, yes.
Thank you. Really wonderful to hear you today, Mary Kathryn. Thank you so much for being with us. And I was really interested by something that you were talking about when you said that there is only one full equity professional company producing Native work full time. And I thought about that in juxtaposition to something else you said. You were talking about kind of the commercialism of representation in stories like Yellowstone, Taylor Sheridan and others. I was wondering if you could dig a little deeper into that, and if I could ask you, does it? I have a guess, but does it actually support any mission or agenda for such commercialism to continue to propagate certain stereotypes in hand with other perhaps somewhat authenticated information? I really am too ignorant to know as a viewer. And that concerns me that I'm too ignorant to know as a viewer. And so one of my questions is, what's up with like a Taylor Sheridan or a Dances with Wolves? What is the heartbeat there? Is there something actually happening that would help further the cause? So thank you.
Well, I'm someone who's very critical and also very optimistic. So I say that because there are people I work with who I deeply respect, who will give their blessings to shows like Yellowstone or Dances with Wolves. And I do sit here and critique aspects of those shows, Dances with Wolves, total white savior story. Should we have no white savior stories? No, it's okay to have white savior stories. But when Dances with Wolves came out, we had nothing where, a native person was the protagonist, right? At least that portrayal wasn't completely dehumanizing of the native characters. They weren't just like, people that killed India or killed white people. So there were some redeeming qualities to it, I think. With Yellowstone, I'm going to be honest, like I've actually seen some of Taylor Sheridan's most recent work and found it to be less problematic than Yellowstone, which I have not watched the show. I was invited to interview to be in the writer's room because he wanted a native writer in there. And I'll be honest, I got to read the draft pilot. Now, hopefully the show's changed some since I read the pilot, but the pilot was like all about this white savior guy, this like awesome sheriff who saves the day. And the Indians were, first of all, a fake tribe, which I always have a problem with because I think it perpetuates this idea that like natives aren't really still here today. Like I want to see stories about actual tribes, just like we see stories about actual other people of color, not fake things, because then I think it kind of still creates the like we're just unicorns from the past myth. But it was a fake tribe who spoke Lakota in like Wyoming, which, I mean, if you're a tribe from Wyoming, you're like deeply offended by that because that's not Lakota territory. And then the characters were like all these like corrupt Indians who had a super rich casino. And it's just really playing into some really harmful, unfair, inaccurate stereotypes. For some reason, Hollywood is obsessed with casinos, Indian casinos, and they do a lot of stories about them. I've been asked to write on like 5 different shows that have an Indian casino. And side note, my husband was actually under President Obama. President Obama appointed him to be the top regulator of Indian gaming. There's the National Indian Gaming Commission. And so like a lot of people think Indian casinos are corrupt and and like very few of them are. I would know because I know very well one of the former regulators in the Obama administration. And anyways, it's like all these stories do not help. They're not based on truth. And I think they're sort of like grabbing at stereotypes and trying to kind of like remold the Western, the archetype of the Western story and narrative in the United States. And the other problem I had, and I think Yellowstone's probably come a long ways because I've heard some Native people say they watched it and they loved it. So maybe it changed. But also when I read the draft pilot, like there was like a one Native woman character in there who was married to one of like the sons of the sheriff, and she had like 2 lines, and like it was just she clearly was like not going to have any kind of depth or development. And it was just going to be about this white savior guy who has a problem because the Indians are trying to take his cattle, and they're like rich, corrupt casino Indians and from a fake tribe that speaks Lakota in Wyoming. And I was like, oh my God, why? So that kind of stuff, like if it's perpetuating stereotypes, it's not helpful. At the same time, it is giving us a place when as Native creators of content, and we go to different Hollywood studios or producers, we say there's clearly an appetite for Native content because these shows are doing well, and these shows have Native stories in them, although they're not really great Native stories. And of course, look, now we've got Res Dogs, and we've got Rutherford Falls, which are Native stories written by Native people. And so things are starting to change. And I do think that as flawed as they were, I would be lying if I didn't say that Dances with Wolves was a step along the way to get where we are today. You got a lot of Native actors who got screen time in that movie and built their careers off of it. And so it's a mixed bag, I guess is what I would say. But the goal should be get Native writers into Hollywood, which we're starting to do, and Native writers into the theaters, which is great that that's starting to happen.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, and that's wonderful. Thank you.
Other questions? I see a couple of my students here, but they're being very, very shy. Very shy. Thank you, Joe. I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't ask your thoughts on the confirmation of Ketanji Brown Jackson and what you're thinking of that.
Well, one, she's extremely well qualified.
Yeah.
She's an excellent judge. I think she would be wonderful on the Supreme Court, and I think she will be on the Supreme Court, and that is my
think she
hope.
will.
And I think that's what's going to happen. I think her confirmation hearing became about a lot of things that have nothing to do with her service on the Supreme Court or her candidacy. And it really was just an opportunity for different senators to attack one another or to grandstand or to dog whistle. And, and that's really unfortunate. And I think too, a lot of senators, well, not even a lot, a tiny handful of senators were trying to use this as an opportunity to score points with their base. And I thought she did an amazing job responding to all of that. I mean, she never cracked, like she just kind of held her own, and she was all this, BS was coming her way. And it's like just kind of disrespectful with some of the questions she got, and she never stooped to that level. And she continued to show respect even when the senators questioning her weren't showing respect to her. I just I have a lot of hope for how the vote will go. But yeah, I mean, there's just some parts of that hearing that were just bananas.
Yeah.
But not surprising coming from people like Ted Cruz or Senator Hawley. I mean,
yeah. Well, thank you.
mm-hmm.
I see a hand from think about Jay Francis or Francis or
Hi, yes, it's Francis.
Francis.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much. I'm here with on behalf of the invitation to the Native American and Indigenous Alliance on campus.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, Michael's our mentor, and he's a really wonderful guy, and was like, you gotta go to this to this event. But so I'm Maya Mam, and Maya Yucateco, so we're from Central America, and a lot of my experience with like our, I guess, like representation of like Hispanic, Latina, indigenous groups has been with film when Roma came out a few years ago. But I haven't heard anything on like theater, like on like in a theatrical like scene. So I was wondering, like, what's your experience with like those kind of stories being built for indigenous populations in the theater scene?
It's a great question. And, I think that I am actually trying to think of a Mayan playwright that I know, and I'm not familiar with one, I'm sorry to say. And I think that that's something to really to focus on and to work on. I think, I actually don't know much about theater, in south of the United States border in terms of what's happening down there. I would hope that indigenous theater artists are getting produced in Mexico and other countries, but I don't know. And I also know, there have been some debates at times within the United States, right? Like, you probably have heard this, like some, citizens of tribes here in the United States say we shouldn't have indigenous writers from Canada or indigenous writers south of the border participate in this contest. It should just be us because we're native writers here and we don't have the opportunities that they have in their countries, and we're not going to their, and that gets really messy really fast. And that's one of the, unfortunate, I think, as in all oppressed communities, there are some resources and people start really grabbing onto them. And so I do know, though, Native Voices at the Autry will produce plays by indigenous playwrights, regardless of whether you are from a tribe within the United States or whether it's Canada or Mexico or El Salvador or Guatemala or Ecuador, or it doesn't matter, although they seem pretty focused on the Western Hemisphere and not indigenous anywhere else. But so I do think for anyone who's interested to look to Native Voices at the Autry, my guess is Delana, as artistic director, will have met some indigenous playwrights from tribes that are not located in the United States. But I'm sorry to say that I actually am not as familiar. And, I think the American stages here in the United States should be open to their writings as well. We produce French playwrights. Heck, Shakespeare's British. We produce him. Like, why would we not produce playwrights whose ancestors have lived here a lot longer than many of our presidents' ancestors. So, I thank you for raising that point, and I'm sorry that I don't know more about, other Indigenous playwrights getting, their work done here in the United States.
So we'll have some homework, Francis. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
Threw in the chat one link from a recent conference that I attended from LMDA, the Literary Managers and Dramaturgs of the Americas.
Cool.
And if you go to their website and search the Puentes conversations, they do deal with some Mayan and Indigenous playwrights in that conversation panel. I participated in it not too long ago. It's fascinating. Just thought I'd throw it out. Might be a start.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank
Great.
you.
Elizabeth.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for the conversation today. It's just been wonderful to be able to take part in it. And I wanted to ask you, as someone who, you spoke about your sort of your entry into the realm in which you're working now. And if you were going to go back into, say, start an undergrad theater program for yourself and your studies, like what are some of the things that you would really love to see? That's talked about, that's studied, that's part of the program, not only just in the academic part, but also the life of the program. Thanks.
I love that question. I studied theater undergrad at Georgetown, but back in the day, so 20 years ago. And wow, can't believe it's been that long. And, none of the theater courses I took taught any Native or Indigenous writers, right? So that was a huge thing. And I think that's part of the reason why I really glommed on to August Wilson and Paula Vogel, because I felt like those were the voices that most closely I felt a connection to. But now that I think back too, I don't really know. I'm trying to think of other communities of color. I'm sure there are a lot of other communities of color that were excluded from that curriculum as well, and I think they're doing a better job today. I've gone back, I've spoken at Georgetown. I know, they've done a lot to change their curriculum in the last 20 years. So I don't want anyone to think that I'm accusing them of that today. But I think the inclusion of writers of different voices and different abilities, right? Having writers that are deaf, having writers that are blind, having writers that are differently abled. There's just so many amazing stories out there, and we're really robbing ourselves of them when we just focus on one canon, right? And I think we're really coming into that realization somewhat actually today more quickly in the academic setting than in the professional theater setting. And so, I look at what you all are doing in these higher institutions of learning, and I'm just excited for all your students to start working at these theaters, because I think that's when we're going to really start to see some change for the good. And I think that, what would I see is just, inclusion of more a diverse group of writers. And, I think one thing I did really like about the education I took is that I did take a theater for social change course. And that course was amazing because it wasn't and so we studied Theater of the Oppressed, but that was 2 classes out of 30 or whatever. And we studied all these different people using theater in very different ways for social change, whether it's mainstream getting a play produced at the Goodman or guerrilla street theater in downtown Seattle about the IMF and World Bank, or whatever. And that was really inspirational to me. So that would be my answer to that question.
That's great. Onawumi, if you don't mind, I'm gonna take a question from the chat, and then we'll let you bring us home, as you are good at doing.
I don't mind at all. I'm so glad to be here. I'm just a happy camper.
Okay, great. I have a question in the chat from Yuris, who is asking, who is curious to know what your writing process is like, especially when centering stories that are personal to you and your family history.
Well, it's challenging. I will say that because it's always hard when it's personal to figure out it's always hard to figure out what stays in and what comes out. I tend to write too much, but it's also really painful to cut things out when it's your family and it's personal because everything is so important. And it's also really scary because it's one thing if I'm writing a story about, let's say, the Shoshone. I'm not Shoshone. None of my family's Shoshone. I may have friends that are Shoshone. I may go spend time with them and do oral history interviews with elders. But at the end of the day, if people don't like the play, it's not a reflection of me. It's a reflection of my work and my art. But when you're working your art is about yourself, it hurts way more when people attack it, don't like it, criticize it. You know, and good art shows its vulnerabilities. Good storytelling, there are vulnerabilities in the protagonist, there are vulnerabilities in the characters, and when that's you, it's really unnerving to put your vulnerabilities on stage. That's what I have found. And I've also found too that this is really true in Indian country, and I know true in a lot of our communities, that all of our tribal communities have trauma. We have intergenerational trauma. We have a lot of trauma. Putting that on stage is triggering for me as I write it. There are just moments where it is very triggering. Then there are moments where it feels very cathartic and healing, but there are those moments that are triggering. And there are those moments where it's triggering for the artists in the room once we start working collaboratively with actors and designers and creating a space where we can all be present and be safe and supportive of one another. You know, so even if let's say I'm writing my Cherokee story and I hire an actress who is Choctaw, you know, she may feel triggered acting in this play at certain points because it mirrors her family's story or her nation's story or the trauma her family's been in, even though it's not biographical to her family, autobiographical. So it's really, the other thing I've learned too is just the need to, it's not just a work of literature that I write because I'm a great writer and yay. It's also something that I'm creating that needs like watering and sunshine and love and care and intention and safety, like boundaries and almost like an agreed upon set of safety protocols for people who are going to be in the room. I mean, when we were working on Mannahatta, we have a moment where a Native man gets scalped, his skin gets ripped off and then sold. And that's really triggering for a lot of people because that is the story of their family, their lineage, you know, that's the story for a lot of Native people in this country. And putting it on stage can be triggering for people, and just wanting to make sure that we're not triggering Native people in the audience. We're not triggering people on stage. And at the end of the day, acknowledging that no matter what you do, some people are going to be triggered anyways. And so how do you care for them when that happens? Yeah.
It's so important. And we're sort of grappling with how to build in a process that holds the discourse around those possibilities for triggering, you know, in the room. Certainly, you know, we haven't got to the audience part yet, but how do we as an ensemble stage this work without re-traumatizing each other and ourselves?
I will say, I only know how to ask the questions. I don't have all the answers yet.
Yeah.
And I ask
Fair
those
enough,
questions.
but you're aware that they're important, and that's
Yeah.
the first step, I think.
And I will say for me, the most important thing is finding a director that asks those questions the first day of rehearsal, that's on board with me about this is our approach to this material and the
Very
stories we're
good.
telling, you know?
Yeah, thank you for that. Onawumi.
Very quickly, there's so much here. There's so much here. Mary Kathryn, I adore you. I adore your work. I adore your vision. I adore you. I do have concern, as you all do, and all of you are activists and conscious and shy and reluctant and triggered, and we are all that. But there are hard questions we have to deal with. Mary Kathryn, I'm a storyteller. Joe Labrana had the nerve to turn me into a playwright. And so that's part of my history. I'm now 85 years old. I was brought up in Jackson, Tennessee. And so the shadow of the Trail of Tears was all across my childhood. Back a few minutes back, quite a few minutes back, there was some talk about who can play what character out of history. And at one point, Mary Kathryn, you said, well, you know, know, it could happen this way, it could happen that way. And why shouldn't Thomas Jefferson be blackface? Never in life, I hope, that a Black actor would play him, and here's why. We need to leave room for white people to deal with the leaders that actually made laws to make our lives hell. And we need the white person in there for that, because a white person did it, and did it because he was white and empowered, self-empowered by his color. We must not be lured by coloration too much when we are dealing with characterizations. So yes, there ought to be room for you to play this, play that, play the other. But there are some places that need to be held, especially when the character is historically a true person. I want to say that, and I say it with humility, although I'm saying it with authority. I say it with humility because I feel strongly triggered by the thought of a blackface George Washington, a blackface playing any of the so-called founders. They didn't find this country, they took it. And so that is why I say that. All of you are activists. And it takes courage to even acknowledge that by yourself. Please take advantage of Professor Bronner's offerings and the people that he is introducing you to, and change and evolve your libraries so that not only are Native stories there, but Ukraine is there. Because when I hear Ukraine, I think of Black Wall Street and what happened to us in this country. When I hear, so we all have something to say to one another because we are all connected. Yes. Even the folks that were at January 6th, those were our crazy relatives. We are all connected.
That's right.
I don't care if it's topaz or if it's turquoise or if it's diamonds with blood on it. We are all connected. We must all listen to one another, question, sit in question circles and answer circles, so that we can hear one another and perhaps make some headway. We will always be in a state of change. We will always be. We are both flawed and sacred human beings. At the same time, it is not either or. At the same time, we are fucked up and we are loving. I love you. I love everything that you all are trying to do here. And I love that you have the courage to even try it. I watched the Oscars last night, and this is my wrap. I watched two people, a third. One of them has just come into having a comfort with her liberated voice, and she has already suffered. That was the white woman. Two of them, my folks, were marginalized, talking to the people that helped to marginalize them. And what did they do? They relied more on self-deprecation than they did on having the courage to speak to the people. And I do not blame them. I do not blame them. But let us look at that, because there's something there. I love you. God bless you. Everyone, whether your face is showing here or not. God bless each and every one of you. And Jola, you know I love you.
I love you.
God bless you.
Love you back.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I'm going to close, but Mary Kathryn, it has been a pleasure, and so many thoughts are brewing in my mind right now. I'm probably going to have to write you
Okay.
to get them all out.
Please do. It's been an
Yeah.
incredible experience for me as well, just to
Yeah.
share, but also to listen and to hear from all of you. And what an amazing community you have there.
Yeah.
This group working together, and to have a theater community like this, or a student community, an academic community, is amazing. Absolutely amazing.
I agree. Thank you. So many thanks to George Mason School of Theater, Mason Players, Players for Change, and the Friends of Theater for their support in publicizing this event. A special shout out, as always, to our program manager, Nicholas, always working tirelessly behind the scenes to get us all here and keep us on track. Thank you. Thank you. Please join us for the next lunchtime chat with Chicano artist educator Luis Alfaro on Monday, April 18th. And until then, take good care. Thank you all for attending.
Goodbye. Thank you.